Thank you, Lilet. Good evening, everyone. And I'm really very happy that you're with so many, because I think we will really have quite an interesting lecture tonight. And as introduced by Lilet, the lecture of Britt Baillie is part of the series of lectures organized by the engagement Legacy, of which the leading theme for this academic year is contested legacy. This means that the master studios that are part of this engagement have special attention for what we inherited. It is clear that legacy can be appreciated differently. It can be loved or admired, but it can also be contested as something some of us don't really want to keep or remember. We can choose to remove those sides, or we can decide that some ideas are so repulsive that they have no place anymore in our discourse. Our legacy can be contested in many different ways, but it always conveys a negative sentiment to some extent. The most comprehensible meaning is in the sense that some buildings, monuments, and places sometimes bring us face to face with parts of our history that are painful or shameful. Over time, they became symbols of injustice for many people. However, at the same time, ideas that have been rejected by one can be admired by others. Same for places that can be contested for some can turn into a memorial for others, or a memorial or a site of commemoration can be created in the construction of collective memory after a disaster or a violent conflict. Memorials claim to be a symbolic means of recognizing victims and achieving closure in processes of seeking truth, justice, and reconciliation, which thus enables or should enable a return or turn to peacetime norms. Yet, memorials are also mobilized to condone physical, symbolic, or structural violence in the present. Thus, they often fail to release societies from cycles of violence fueled by the legacies of past conflicts or oppression, what often results in a kind of parallel commemoration of both conflicting parties. It is in that sense we would like to introduce Britt Baillie and her agonistic approach to heritage. Within such an approach, we don't seek for victory or defeat. In that sense, I'd like to refer here to Chantal Mouffe, who argues that in a democratic polity, conflicts and confrontations, far from being a sign of imperfection, indicate that democracy is alive and inhabited by pluralism. I'm really very honored to introduce you to Britt Baillie. She's an archaeologist and a specialist in critical heritage studies. She will draw on examples from Africa and beyond to illustrate why a shift to an agonistic approach to heritage could play a vital role in the movement for decolonization. Britt Baillie obtained a PhD in archaeology and heritage management at the Department of Archaeology, University of Cambridge. Her thesis title was The Wounded Church: War, Destruction and Reconstruction of Vukovar's Religious Heritage. She's a founding member of the Center for Urban Conflict Research at University of Cambridge. Her work on contested heritage has always been interdisciplinary, working closely with architects and urbanists from a variety of backgrounds. Her interest in decolonization materialized first in her work on the living religious heritage of Angkor in Cambodia, guided her work in the former Yugoslavia, Israel, Palestine, and more for the last 6 years in South Africa and more recently in Kenya. She published the African Heritage Challenges volume, which she co-edited with Marie-Louise Sorensen. In this volume, she explores how heritage can promote, secure, or undermine sustainable development, and in turn, how this affects conceptions of heritage. She has just finished the volume entitled Synchronous Pasts, Transforming Heritage in the Former Yugoslavia, with Gruja Badescu and Francesco Mazzucchelli, which will be forthcoming later this year, addressing in part what she calls heritage in conflict time. She is currently working on a volume on heritage, conflict, and decolonization in Angkor, and she co-edited the Palgrave Studies in Cultural Heritage and Conflict series, which currently has already 20 volumes. This might be of interest to those engaging with the lecture series of the engagement legacy, more particularly on the topic of contested or critical heritage. It is with great pleasure that I now give the floor to Britt Baillie.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending where you are in the world. And thank you very much, Lilet and Gisèle, for inviting me. I'm really excited about this opportunity to speak in Leuven virtually this time. It's been a while since I've been with you in Belgium, but it's always wonderful to get the opportunity to come back. And before, or when Gisèle invited me, she asked me, what will I be speaking on this evening? And I actually wrote back giving her a few options because I thought they could fit into the engagement series, which has been fascinating so far. And this is the one that she chose. So hopefully it will fit with what you've been wanting. And also, hopefully it'll resonate with some of the big questions I think that have been asked over 2020. I mean, we've just entered into 2021. So it's a short time to look backwards over recent history, but I think it's important that we start to do that already now and to fit it into a much longer context. So that's what I aim to do today. And I'm going to share my screen with you. Wonderful. So the picture that you see on the screen in front of you is the statue of Paul Kruger in the center of Church Square in downtown Pretoria, which is now in what is known as the municipality of Tshwane in South Africa. Now, I've been working on contested heritage and heritage and conflict for many years, but in 2014, my journey took me to South Africa just in time to see the Rhodes Must Fall and the so-called statue wars which followed in its wake. And being on campus in Pretoria, I was only a stone's throw away from the statue of Kruger, which ended up being one of the elements that was, or the statues that was vandalized, if you want to use that word, or effaced, or whatever you want to just define it as. And I think words are important, so I'll come back to that as part of those statue campaigns. In the aftermath of that, you can see that there was this fence erected around it. And that fence I want you to bear in mind as we go through this talk, as I'll be returning to it later. But the image that you see, the vandalism that you see, and I'm not sure if it's clear enough on your screens, but at the base of the pedestal, you can see it says "Killer, Killer." And in front of that, on the ground, there was an attempt to write that we can't breathe, in reference to the Black Lives Matter protests that have been happening globally during 2020. And this episode of graffiti imposed onto the memorial actually happened in 2020 as part of demonstrations at the American Embassy, which you can, as a capital city, these monuments aren't just speaking to the rest of the memorial scape, if you like, but they're also speaking very much to global discourses and global dialogues, which is true of other cities, but perhaps more, even more profoundly so within the capital city context. So today, I want to talk more about this particular memorial, and I will, but I want to step back, I think, from the cold surface of this discussion to think more about ways that heritage has been influenced by colonialism. And I'm going to focus today on what I call 6 mobilizations, which I think of as key, but obviously this is subjective and it's a selection for the purposes of this talk. I'll then go on to very briefly doing a very short introduction to sort of shifting models or ways we've thought about biographies of monuments over time. Then inverse those 6 mobilizations and sort of unpack what's happened to them in the phase of decolonization before moving back to the case of Kruger, and then finishing off with a few thoughts of heritage and agonism. And as I said, this work really started when I began working with the city of Tshwane before the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, but it's also very much dovetailed with the work that I've been doing on the African Heritage Challenges volume that Gisèle mentioned in my introduction, which came out last year. So this was an opportunity to sort of bring back those 2 projects together. So in the introduction, Gisèle mentioned that or in my abstract as well, I've mentioned that I intend to speak about colonialism or case studies mainly from the continent of Africa, but with some other case studies dropping in, making an appearance as well. And the reason of that is because colonialism was a very pervasive system, as you can see from the map from 1914, that's the background of this image. It really was a system which impacted the globe nearly as a whole, not all of it as a force, whether it be the colonized countries or the metropoles, the colonial metropoles. And many would argue, if you were to go beyond the Oxford English Dictionary definition, which I've put there, which is colonialism as being the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial control over another country. Many regard the creation of independent settler states, which came in their wake, like the US, like South Africa, Canada, etc., as just a continuation of European colonialism. And I want to address that as part of this broader decolonization debate. And I think the big questions that I'm tapping into in a very small way are how and should the legacy of colonialism be remembered today, and what should be done with the extant colonial heritage. I have no intention of answering those two in full, and I'll come back to why that is. But I think these are questions that are being asked around the globe at this moment, and which I think need further engagement with. The reason that I decided to focus on predominantly on African examples is because the impact of colonialism was felt very rapidly there around the turn of the century. In the 1880s, there was only about 10% of Africa that was under European control. And by the early 20th century, that was already up to 90%. So it's one of the continents that's been really heavily affected. And it's very much been carved out into colonial entities from a very different geographical landscape, which predated colonialism. At the same time, I realized that by addressing a continent as a whole, that I potentially fall prey into reproducing the colonial gaze, and that's by no means my intention today. And it's also by no means my intention to suggest that the very rich and heterogeneous nature of African cultures is in any way homogeneous, or that they were in any way indeed affected by colonialism in the same way. They're not. However, I do think that we can point to certain trends which cross-cut different spaces within that continent, and which potentially speak to other contexts internationally. And as Gisèle mentioned, I am also working on a volume that looks at decolonization within the Cambodian context as well. And so that's why I'm constantly thinking across boundaries and borders, many of which were artificially imposed during this period. So to move on to the 6 mobilizations that I've chosen that look at how heritage and colonialism have dovetailed and been used by each other, I'm going to start with just focusing on what I think heritage is. I think there's a big tendency within popular discourse in particular, but also within other realms to conflate history and heritage, and they're by no means the same thing. So in this diagram, you can see that I've drawn a circle representing the past, and not all of what was the past survives. We can see that, very many, if you know wooden materials or cloth materials, they just simply never get passed down. Whole peoples die out from diseases, outbreaks, colonization, not completely erasing their culture, but often suppressing their culture to the extent that it's not passed down in its full form, or not that any culture is static by any means, but that much knowledge is sometimes lost, particularly in wars or in crises. So what remains of the past are both intangible practices, which are passed down orally often, and bodily through embodied practices, and tangible remains. And from them, we select, and by we, I mean us as a collective, not just experts, but mainly experts at this point, select what is considered to be of importance to regard as heritage. And then we ratify that into lists on the global, national, regional, local, etc. scale. So heritage is not history. It's a subsection of what we think is important in the present, and it's constantly changing. When the colonial endeavors began on the continent of Africa, and I think one of the first endeavors in this way was a huge scientific mission that Napoleon launched. And his aim was to reposition the heritage of Egypt as a cultural property and to reposition France as the heirs to this property, because he envisioned that the ancient Egypts were so divorced from modern Egypt that France, as a true civilization, was a more appropriate heir than locals who lived in that vicinity. And this is, of course, what Said labeled positional superiority. And he was able to do that by taking heritage out of a living matrix. So in the African context, or in African contexts, plural rather, heritage is often part of a lived experience. It's part of everyday life. It's a part of everyday practices. But he started the process of removing physical elements and actually taking them back to France in the first instance. And this was something that other colonial endeavors also followed, such as the British, when they seized the Benin bronzes, which they then took to the British Museum, where they sit to this day. So what essentially happened with this process, with divorcing artifacts from their context, but also divorcing increasingly physical sites from the living communities around them, is that these objects were transformed into relics, monuments, antiquities, and natural heritage sites. So taken out of the living context and transformed into something else. And this enabled a totally different model of caretaking. So whereas in the past, local communities, and I don't mean to romanticize this, and I will definitely come back to the problematic nature of communities. I'm just using it as a shorthand here. But local agents and communities would take care of what they regarded their heritage, although they may not have termed it in that way. But then it was excised from their control. They were often seen as pious vandals or as anti-modern thinkers whose traditions needed to be erased by the modernity brought in by the colonial regimes. And so their heritage was taken out of the realm of their protection or their caretaking and put into the control of conservation professionals who were all trained in Europe at that point. And as part of that, they delegitimized traditional knowledge keepers. The quote that you see in the far right-hand corner by Desmond Tutu talks about how the role that Christianity and the missionaries had in subverting traditional forms of knowledge. In places like Nigeria, the colonizing forces, they wanted to use local rulers as a form of indirect rule. And they found the Igbo tribe didn't have tribal leaders, and so they created what they called warrant leaders. So the image on the left is what you see is one of those. So they created a tradition in a culture which had decided things more on a consensual basis prior to that. So they imposed new traditions into this space and subverted local traditions and the keepers of knowledge. In turn, they introduced what Brockington has referred to as fortress conservation. So this was the idea that large swathes of the continent were wilderness, and wilderness is not actually natural. It's a construct. It's a Western construct. Most of these landscapes are cultural landscapes, which involved, and as over time, as we look at conservation, we can see the dramatic impact that humans have had on the Anthropocene or the human affected landscape and period in Africa. And as part of this, the construction of conservation areas, both natural and cultural, Dowie estimates that 14 million people across the continent were displaced. And remember that they weren't just displaced from the spaces themselves or from their homes, but they're also displaced from their livelihoods and the wealth of that land. And this is in addition to settlers taking other parts of and settling on other parts of the landscape. And of course, during colonialism and its extreme successor form of the apartheid, many local people were refused access to these sites. So they were exclusively for the use of the settlers or colonists. The site that you see in the bottom right-hand corner is Tulamela, which was an important Iron Age trade site linking South Africa to trade in India and beyond. And it was quite a rich heritage site, which was only excavated in the 1990s. But it's within the Kruger National Park. There are actually over 400 archaeological sites in the Kruger National Park, which is the size of Belgium. Imagine the displacement caused by the creation of that park. So over 400 archaeological sites in that space, many of which were very important. And it's a past to which, until the 1990s, the majority of the population in South Africa were denied. The fourth point I want to bring in is the idea of the mission civilisatrice. So this is the political rationale purporting to facilitate the modernization and westernization of indigenous peoples. And this was a mechanism used to legitimize colonial rule. As part of that, disciplines like anthropology were brought in, especially evolutionary anthropology, were brought in and used to demonstrate that falsely, that white people were at the top of the evolutionary platform and that Black people were lower on the evolutionary development, which is of course entirely false. And as part of that, the woman that you see depicted in this engraving, Saartjie Baartman, she was not only physically while alive exhibited in freak shows, as what they were called at the time, much akin to, there was also human zoos happening across Europe at this time, often featuring individuals from the African continent. But when she died, her skeleton and a cast of her body were placed side by side, in naked as well, in view at the Musée de l'Homme, and they were there on public view until 1974. And it wasn't until 2002 that these remains were repatriated and that she was given a decent burial, a proper burial, one should say, within the South African context. And so her case is just to show that, as Gordon Chimbera says at the bottom here, that the domination of Africans was explained with the aid of science, thereby establishing the Khoisan, of which Saartjie was a member, as the most ignoble group of the progression of mankind, purported to mate with the orangutan. So quite a degrading approach to culture. There is also, and here you see an image of Nelson Mandela at his Headtown Mission School. And in his Long Walks for Freedom, he talks about how the headmaster at his school was a descendant of Wellington, and he came in and would tell them how he and his forebears had saved Europe from the French in this case, but also that they were bringing civilization to the continent, to the African continent, specifically to South Africa. And he talks about how these ideas were internalized, and that they were taught to believe that English ideas and government were the best, and to aspire to be like the English, rather than appropriating some of both models or trying to see the value within their own culture. So it's a colonization of the mind through a colonization of the curriculum. Ultimately, this was also achieved, and this is the last one I'm going to focus on today. Of course, we could go into a whole myriad of other ways that colonialism impacted heritage, but heritage within the system was whitewashed. So, or across the continent was whitewashed. So you had statues to colonial rulers being erected across the continent. You had history being written by white scholars predominantly. You had excavations being carried out under the auspices of white scholars, but with the physical labor of Black individuals. But there was a divorce between the labor that went into these sites and then the interpretation of them, which became afterwards. And as a part of this, science was often suppressed. So in the quote that you can see in the top right, this is Paul Sinclair writing about his experience in Zimbabwe, a Great Zimbabwe site, where they weren't allowed to publicly state that Blacks had built the site just prior to independence, and they were also not allowed to mention radiocarbon dates, which indicated that it had been built by Black people from the continent, which was contested at the time. It was claimed that it was built by Mycenaeans or others. And statistics are unfortunately not available for the entire continent, but if we just take South Africa as one example, by the time we got even to into the 1990s, only 2% of sites within South Africa were dedicated to Black heritage. So I want to take a pause from heritage and colonialism at the moment and just move quickly over to a sort of a broader view of the shifting models of biographies of monuments. There's this idea that heritage or monuments are intended to be erected for perpetuity. They're made of highly durable materials. They're put on plinths. They're supposed to be highly visible. But Robert Musil already started in the 1930s discussing how, despite their being positioned as having this, eternal message, actually they become invisible within our landscapes. And I'm sure all of you have had that experience as you've walked through an urban landscape and you've passed probably countless memorials and you're not sure what many of them are for. And Sturkin in 2007, looking at American or US context, argued that perhaps memorials remove the onus for us to remember. Once they're present, it's like, okay, now our duty to remember has been done and we can get on with our day-to-day living. And the city which evolves around these individual moments. And sometimes, memorials or monuments actually completely fade into living. Our European landscape, the African landscape is strewn with memorials or tombs, like here I've used the example of Tutankhamun, which have been completely forgotten over time. And even though these were elite rulers and quite, impressive grave sites, the contents were completely lost to the powers of time. So it's this idea of the slow and gradual disappearance into forgetting. And I argued in an earlier paper that this is in part due to chronocentrism, which is our society's desire to focus on more recent conflicts potentially than older ones, or to selectively link older conflicts together in a worldview which legitimizes our particular current standpoint. So I think both of these are coming into play when we think about this gradual decline model. But then in the 1970s, Thompson introduced this idea of rubbish theory, where he talked about how these or it's been used subsequently to talk about how memorials start off as high value. And he argued that high value or durable materials would stay high value. So if you imagine your grandmother's diamond ring, it gets passed on generation to generation because it's high value and it's made of a durable material. Where more functional items he thought would eventually be transformed into rubbish. They would lose their value over time, become rubbish, and then just be forgotten. Or alternatively, a catalytic event would raise them back into the public attention. And this model has been modified several times since then, but I think it still holds some value. And I just want to discuss it in reference to this particular monument in Dakar, the Demban Dupont Memorial, which was set up in 1923 to commemorate the French soldiers who fought in the French armies. The Senegalese soldiers who fought in the French armies. And it was erected in 1923, and you can see it's a fraternal embrace between a Frenchman and a Senegalese counterpart who've been personified as Demban and Dupont. That's the sort of popular name for them. And then Senegal achieved independence, but the memorial remained in what's standard. And some of you might be familiar with his work because he works a lot on the Belgian context and decolonization within the Belgian context. So they entered in this period of quiescence where it was there, but it wasn't something that was causing vocal debates in public. But in 1983, the government decided to move it to the outskirts of the city, and you can see where it was relocated to on the map at the bottom, where it remained in a Catholic cemetery, which obviously is beyond the majority of public's view because it's not the dominant religion in Senegal. But then France decided to around the centenary of some of these events, they decided to reevaluate the role of foreign soldiers on the colonies within their own commemorative platforms within France. And that stimulated a movement, a catalytic event, if you'd like, for it to be resurrected more close to the center of town once again. So the catalytic event can be a multitude of different types of things. They can be either negative or positive moments. So catalytic events can also be discovery, archaeological discovery, for example. They can be a war. And this cycle isn't, I've indicated with the dotted line that it doesn't always have to go through this particular perambulation. Sometimes we go straight from quiescence into a catalytic event. But also what I like about this model is that it's cyclical. Because what I think we can see if we take the long durée rather than this very short focus, on just the BLM movement, for example, we can see that that these memorials have several different phases to their lives. And then the last model that I want to look at is this idea of a durable effigy, which is my terminology that I'm playing with. So please feel free to comment on it or let me know what you think. But Tausig pointed out in 1999 that monuments cry out to be toppled, besmirched, and desecrated. And if you think about it, the word vandalism was coined within the French and English languages around the French Revolution when the monuments of the Ancien Regime were pulled down and destroyed. And that was also what caused or perpetuated some of the heritage movement, was to protect some of these artifacts from the Ancien Regime for the post-revolutionary society, or the post-revolution society. And what we see this sort of every kind of regime change or major staging point in our contemporary society, we see that these episodes, if you think about the fall of Saddam Hussein, if you think about the transition from Soviet power, it's become part of regime change. And Marshall suggests that these repressed histories that are always within the very body of the monument memorial, and because of their mimetic qualities, the fact that they look like the person who's intended or regarded as the enemy, that they're ripe for attack. And what I argue is that perhaps we should stop thinking of them as fixed, durable forms, but rather think of them more as effigies, it's often a model of a person that's made precisely with the intent for it to be damaged or destroyed within a protest. So I think they constantly have both of these roles embodied within their very materiality. So now I'm going to switch back and talk about heritage in the pursuit of decolonization. And I'm going to go back to those 6 mobilizations that I talked about in the beginning and think about what impact they've had more recently. So decolonization has not been uniform across the continent. And I just want to clarify that I'm not just speaking about the Declaration of Independence or the obtaining political independence, but I'm also very much talking about the efforts to challenge the hegemonic historical accounts and political discourses rooted in colonialism, which have been attributed to a universal character and that are claimed to be superior to other systems of knowledge, as I've highlighted on this slide, just to be clear about what I'm talking about. So undoing the whitewashing was one of the first things that many colonial governments or post-colonial governments engage in with as part of their nation building attempts. So this involved the classic attempts at renaming, removing, replacing, and filling in the blanks that we're so familiar with. And I've taken the example of Great Zimbabwe here, as it's the only country in the world that's named after an archaeological site. The avian figure that you see on the flag is from Great Zimbabwe. It features on, you know, stamps, currency, et cetera, classic use of the past for nation building. It was also filling in the blanks with, you know, with members of the freedom struggle, as you see in the Heroes Acre image from the bottom. But again, Rochelle reminds us that the eradication of colonial era statues and monuments after independence often proceeded far more slowly, selectively, and unsystematically than we commonly assume. So even in a place like Zimbabwe, which was very anti-imperialist, we still find Victoria Falls being referred to as Victoria Falls. We still find statues of Livingstone overlooking those falls, claiming, you know, he claimed to be the person who found or discovered those falls. And we still see mementos of colonial nostalgia in the particular forms of hotels and hospitality industry aligning those kinds of sites as well. Now, if we think about decolonizing the mind, again, right from the beginning, the first president of Botswana, Seretse Khama, for example, talked about the need to write history books to prove that they are, or to demonstrate Black history that had been all but erased from the dominant models. And so what we see here is that the map on the left is actually indicating public health literature in 2015 and how it was skewed against the African continent. So still within the academy today, and definitely still within the curricula of the academy, as you can see from the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, which also was about fees must fall. We have a long way to go in terms of decolonizing the mind. If we talk about another strategy, which is the commemoration of victims of the dark side of the mission civilistique, sort of the inverse or the mirror of that. Again, we can see this is an example from Namibia, where German troops were responsible for genocides against the Herero and Nama communities in the early 1900s. But on the side of a concentration camp, we had the memorial, the Reiterdenkmal, which stood there until 2010. So, you know, considerable amount of time after Namibia gains independence, and it was only in 2014 that the new Independence Memorial Museum, the Sam Njuma sculpture, and the genocide statue to commemorate those individuals was raised, and the other statue, the Reiterdenkmal, was put into the adjacent German fort out of sight of the victims of genocide who were being commemorated. In terms of fortress conservation, that's not something that's changed. In fact, it's been enhanced. So not only do we hear UNESCO calling for buffer zones and increased fencing, we see countries like Rwanda investing $2.5 million to create 120 kilometers of fenced area. Uganda, Malawi enhancing their fencing. And of course, there is the issue of poaching, but I think we have to think very carefully about what poaching is, and you know, some of this is very much subsisting poaching, which could be seen as a result of the exclusion of people from these landscapes, and that divorce then criminalized their activities on the same landscape which they had been using in pre-colonial or pre-conservation times. So, in a heightened anti-poaching technology uses with electrified fences, SWAT teams, and even the use of drones at the moment. So, and that's not just for natural heritage, we're also seeing this, as you saw in the first image, being applied to cultural heritage sites as well. So there are claims that traditional forms of knowledge are being revalued. And in 2003, UNESCO released the Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage. But it's been criticized heavily, and I won't go into the details, that we can talk about that in the questions, but as being quite underwhelming. It's still under the control of the nation state, so, and under the control of heritage experts, again, mainly educated within the Western system. So how much knowledge do the power holders actually have? And does this categorization, this sort of meta categorization, actually place traditional forms of knowledge in a binary, a false binary with so-called modern or scientific forms of knowledge. In terms of the World Heritage, if we look back at those ideas of cultural property still are very much entrenched within the World Heritage Convention. And I think that's part of why we see that Africa is radically represented in the World Heritage Map, and particularly in terms of its cultural sites. And again, I just want to remind that most of its natural sites are not really natural. They are the creations of humans and the environment which surrounds them. So the model which has become the dominant model at the end of this until recently is this idea of the conservation professionals now going out and engaging with stakeholder groups or community groups, and then making the ultimate decision about what should happen with heritage. So just to come back to Kruger quickly as an example of what is happening within the context of Pretoria and why I think this is an important model. So there's long been debates about Kruger. From the moment the statue was conceived of, even before its production, it was already contested, because at the time, the Boer republics didn't usually have statues of living presidents, and they really thought it smacked of imperialism. But they decided to commission it, and it arrived in Maputo right at the height of the South African War, also known as the Anglo-Boer War, the Second Anglo-Boer War. And this is the borders that you can see with the Anglo-Boer War positioning the Cape Colony against the South African Republic, the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, with Kruger being the head statesman of the South African Republic. And because of the ongoing conflict, the statue wasn't erected until 1913. But when it was erected, it was missing 4 of its soldiers who'd been taken as part of the conflict, as part of cultural property, if you like, by the victors and taken to the UK. Then, in 1925, as Afrikanerdom started to, or members of the Afrikaner group started to regain political power, it was moved to the place in front of the railway station, which is a prominent position in town, but not the church square, which is the main square, which was originally designed for it to go. However, in 1948, the National Party, which became the party that implemented apartheid regulations, they decided to have it erected in Church Square as a part of an Afrikanerization of the city to show dominance or political power within the city. So it was unveiled by D.F. Malan in 1954. And as part of his rule, he also established the infamous Churchill Monument, which you can see in these images, and it became a site of massive contestation. So during the struggle against apartheid, the combatants argued that it should be demolished and abandoned, it should be recycled to build houses for the poor, that it should be fashioned into a memorial and a public urinal for the Black population, just to mention a few things. But Mandela found that that wasn't a viable option, that to ensure reconciliation, it was very important not to affront the powerful white minority who valued this place as a symbol of their identity. Subsequently, in the post-1994, it's become a dumping ground for memorials that have been unwanted in other parts of South Africa. So there has been selective removal within the city of particular types of statuary, but it doesn't mean that, and I'm bringing this up because you here see that the Herzog statue has been replaced by a statue of Mandela at the Union Buildings, which is one of the seats of power in Pretoria. And but that didn't mean that that was the fate of all of the memorials within the city. The different solutions can be made for the same type of heritage within a very small space or within close relation to each other. And it's often assumed that it won't be. Since independence, there's also been a move to raise new memorials, such as this memorial to Chief Swane, who, and it's debated whether he was a real figure or not, but he was supposed to have resided in this area prior to the arrival of the Afrikaners. And it's really interesting to note that it's precisely these, prior to the Rhodes Must Fall movement, and potentially even after, it was the memorials that have been raised by the post-apartheid government, which were most often targeted for vandalism. But it should also be noted that there's also a form of acquisitive vandalism. So in a society with such a high Gini coefficient, where the division between rich and poor is so vast, many of the residents are forced into a type of subsistence vandalism, where they steal bronze plaques literally to sell for a few rand. So a lot of memorials are damaged not out of political motivations, but out of economic ones. And this statue that you can see, as I mentioned before, was defaced not by white South Africans, who painted it with the blue, white, and orange flag, the apartheid era flag, and wrote the letters BB for Black Bastard on it, and urinated on it as well. This statue has been covered in silver paint in 2014, right before the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And this was a part of the Cool Capital Biennale, where the artist R1 wanted to take it out of Musil's the slow forgetting or the latent period that it had fallen in, and force people to reflect on its meaning once again. Then in 2015, after Rhodes Must Fall, it had already been, the calls for its removal had already been made in 2010 by the ANC Youth League. And they, after Rhodes Must Fall, where you started to see similar attacks on other heritage sites or monuments across the country, there were calls for its removal as well. And green paint was poured on it. And this became quite a contentious issue, with the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighter Party, claiming responsibility of it and demanding that all colonial era or apartheid era memorials should be removed. And this was countered by members of the Afrikaner ethnic group, who wanted to retain this and categorize this as a genocide against their cultural identity, with people chaining themselves to the memorial and posting armed guards around its base. And so temporarily, the Metro Police, unable to spare the manpower to protect this memorial, surrounded it with barbed wire, which was very unsightly. And so this palisaded fence was put around Kruger, his fortress or his lager, to keep the public away from precisely the memorial which the public is supposed to be using in a public space. And it's quite sad that public memorials have to be fenced in or caged in. And this is true for many of the city's memorials that they are, and museums are fenced in this way. So they're removed from the public realm. And as part of this whole Rhodes Must Fall movement, there was an instigation by the Ministry of Arts and Culture to investigate how the country's heritage landscape should be transformed. And I'm coming to a close here, so please just bear with me. So an audit of the statues is being carried out, and what was determined was that those which were not considered to be in line with South Africa's contemporary values would be removed and put into parks and museums. And this was done through a lot of consultation, of which I participated in some. But the voices were really restricted mainly to political elites, economic elites, scholarly experts, and it did not reach, I would argue, the increasingly angry yet powerless groups, which is why I think they haven't had the resonance that they could have. So the Kruger statue was deemed exempt from this in 2018, but by 2020, we already see new calls in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement for it to be first labeling it or defacing it with the words killer, and then subsequently another call for its removal to be replaced with the name of the Rugonia trialists, like Nelson Mandela, who were the conclusion of their trial, which eventually ended in his imprisonment, was conducted just behind this memorial. But the estimated cost, which also have to be taken into effect, as well as the cost of cleaning, etc., was over €500,000. So this is considerable in a state where we have such a large Gini coefficient. So to finish with some thoughts on heritage and agonism, I hope that the case that I showed you of Kruger makes you realize that heritage is often contested right from the beginning, and that that's an inherent in the nature of heritage, is that it's either has that vibrancy that which is often because of its contestation, or it starts to fade is because the onus for it to remain in the public light starts to fade or be replaced by other things. And so I think what we've seen to date is very much this antagonistic model, where it's top down, the government officials, experts, etc., say this is how it should be, and that's imposed onto the populace. But as the quote that Gisèle mentioned at the beginning, I think we have to stop viewing heritage as a static product, and rather start thinking of it as a tool in the stage in debate about what we want our societies to be like. So just to bring it back to what this term means, if we go back to the old Greek, it refers directly to a contest. It's not really about thinking about the end of the contest, about the victory, defeat, but more about thinking about the struggle itself. And that's where I want to reposition it from product, or where do we put this thing, to more about how do we focus on the debates about why are these debates important. And so it's about moving from this antagonistic win-lose type of engagement with the past, and rather concentrating on the potentially what Nietzsche would refer to as the qualitative transformation of antagonisms into productive agonisms. Not easy, I know, but I think if we start to view monuments as effigies within the public space stage, we can start to create that move. And we can already see it being argued in both Moof's work on art museums, and Posey's 2013 study on national museums, in my earlier work in 2013, as well as Bull, Hansen, and Parrish's work on war museums within the European context. I think what I want to end on with this is to, in terms of architects, as you as architecture students, the majority of you is to move away from this idea of the permanency and to embrace the longue durée of the memorial, if you like, and to think about how we can use these spaces to have productive agonistic debates, which are positive for our democracy, rather than leaning into these antagonistic models. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Britt. This was a heavy one. I mean, it was really impressive, and I was following with a lot of attention. But I would just check if there are already questions from our audience. So feel free to ask questions. The debate is open. Otherwise, I could just start maybe the discussion. Because in the cases that you were showing, we start from a memorial. And I was just wondering, imagine we want to create such a memorial, which is agonistic. Do you think that would be feasible?
Well, that's exactly what they attempted. I think it was a Hera project. They published the research in 2018, but they did it within museum spaces. So they attempted to address the Second World War through exhibitions which would bring in a plurality of voices, using mainly digital technology, because one of the things that's problematic with these sites is the materiality of them can be static. Obviously it's shifting increasingly, but that was their attempt to do that. It did cause a lot of debate about whether their approach had been successful or not, whether people felt re-traumatized or re-victimized by particular narratives that they were exposing, particularly perpetrators' narratives. And I think that, yes, it's a big ask, to do this with it, particularly with if we step out of that museum space and into the public realm, it's a difficult task. But I would argue that in the context of particularly the countries in Africa that I've looked at, and again, I'm not trying to generalize about Africa as a whole, is that, often when I would go to a museum, unfortunately, in both Kenya and in South Africa, or in the other countries that I visit, I'm often the only person there, which means that these museums are not public. They're not really serving the public. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what is public space within the African or South African context? And I think that's, we have this idealized idea of public space being this this space of like the agora. We have this sort of model in our minds of it being like agora, where people come to be together and engage. And unfortunately, because of the segregation policies of the colonial era and post-colonial era in countries like South Africa, though there was no true public space. Only white people were allowed to use the space as true public space. And unfortunately, there was lots of bylaws that were put into place which maintained that. So you would have bylaws against trading, bylaws against gathering in those spaces, bylaws against sitting on particular infrastructure within those spaces. And unfortunately, that's carried on into the way that people sometimes engage with those spaces today. And I recently did a project on public space within Johannesburg, and what we were seeing is that many of the public spaces are abandoned. They're simply regarded as unsafe, and so people don't use them within the centers of the cities. Not all, many are actively used, but only by subsections of the population. So it's very rare to find places that are not neoliberal bubbles and which are not liminal spaces which have been left to their own devices, which many people avoid because they're considered dangerous. So I think the memorials and monuments within the South African context being within this compromised public space have an even more important role than they do in other contexts where museum going is more of a part of the culture of the majority of the citizens. I think that we need to start taking the discussions into these public spaces and really making them public by asking people to engage with these questions. And I think, we can always point to other examples in other contexts, but I think, if you go to somewhere like Berlin, you come across the Stolperstein, for example, and you can't but help to confront that past because it's there. And I think that we have to start to embrace that. There's been attempts before, but I haven't seen one that's been truly successful within the South African context. I mean, if you think about Freedom Park, which is just around the road, just across from the Churchill Monument, which I showed you, millions of rand were spent on that site, but people don't really use it. It's fenced in away from its neighboring site. It's often used for tourists and ceremonial purposes. It's not a part of it's excised from the day-to-day part of the community.
We have a question from Abir Alaham.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the very, very beautiful, very valuable lecture. Actually, I do write a lot about heritage and not contested heritage per se, but about heritage and tradition. But you started your talk about heritage, and heritage is what is selected by the experts to be heritage. Now, if the people choose not to consider this contested negative heritage as heritage, so it's the right of the people, and we cannot consider that type of heritage to be agonism. It is very much rejected. And we have in one of the Arabic countries here, we have a case that I was so much interested in, about the Black people who are part of the people in the same country. In the past, they used to suffer, they used to be kind of slaves, and they used to suffer. Now, Now they are building museums to document and to show the suffering of those people who now they became part of the community. So the issue is not anymore there, but such kind of museums will keep reminding them of their negative past. So for me, we should not actually kind of enforce or kind of enhance such emotions, such negative memories of the people themselves. So they chose not to have it, whether it is the colonizers or kind of same community, but part of the community being slaves or so. So I can't see a point in reshaping such memory, kind of make it easier for the others to absorb it.
To absorb it, right?
I mean, to accept it. Yeah,
So
it is rejected. It is rejected as a memory. Collective memory of the people will reject such kind of heritage. So why to keep it? Why to protect it or defend it?
Well, I think that the issue that we have is that particularly settler societies, which, you know, so the countries which have become where you've had a dominant or a large portion of settlers remain in situ. Many colonies had witnessed widespread dispersal or weren't settled densely, but in the country we've had quite dense settlement by during the colonial period. What we have is our multiple perspective. So it's a plural society where you have different groups, different interest groups. And I mean, every society has different interest groups. And even, you know, I think it's really problematic to lump every colonial effigy into or similar effigy into the same category. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. I definitely think that we need to have bespoke, you know, it's not a one size fits all approach that we should be going for. I think that's very difficult. And rather we should be looking for ways to fit the needs of that particular population of the time. So you can see that there are also communities which rejected colonial heritage early on, like the Dakar example that I showed you, colonial heritage, and then brought it back into play later on. So I don't think that it's a question of either or. I think it's more of a question of, you know, thinking about that these things can come in and out of power over time, and that we have to embrace that we have multiple potential answers to what we should do with each individual site. And I think that's where architecture becomes really interesting, is they can start to think about those tailored, just bespoke reactions to these particular places and what makes sense for that particular monument. That's why, you know, I think we've seen these attempts to, you know, to put all colonial memorials into a museum, and they simply they don't work. They take things, they recontextualize them into a setting which is very artificial, and where they often don't speak to the broader history of that particular place. So I think it's not about, you know, we have to ask, where is democracy coming into this this equation? And within the South African context, as I said, after Roseman's fall, there were panels and debates set up to debate precisely what should happen to these memorials, and an audit was done because it was recognized that not all memorials should be treated equally. But I think where the real problem lies is that the voices in those many of those meetings were quite restricted, and the discussions were not held they weren't held in an open forum, which would allow who are often marginalized from positions of power to engage within those discussions. And I think it's, you know, whenever we look at heritage within the urban scale, talking about engagement of people around those sites is incredibly difficult, because just of the scale and the fact that these are nested communities, you know, within nations, within continents, within regions, within the city, sometimes within a particular neighborhood. So it's always very complicated to do. But I think that's why, you know, if we think of these catalytic moments that we can sort of curate, if you like, that can help. Rather than saying we need to come up with a permanent solution for this particular site, we can think, okay, how do we create this dialogue in this particular space? What's right for this particular site? And as we can see, there's lots of different, even within this one example, lots of different approaches have been tried. And I think what we're going to see is a continuation of that journey of that memorial.
Thank you. I would love to give the word to Vincent. Vincent, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good evening. Thank you very much for and a very interesting lecture. I was wondering your perspective on a potential architectural translation of the insights that you have developed from your work, especially regarding this agonistic approach in space production under these contexts, which fundamentally function as anocracy. Majority of African nation states are not democratic. So how does this translate, the agonistic approach in architecture now? Because it's not just only, like you already mentioned, heritage is only not just monuments, but also our lived reality, and some other aspects of it are part of it. So I was just wondering your perspective on that.
No, it's a great comment. I mean, I'm not an architect, as I think we mentioned before. So, my skill is not to. It's more to analyze rather than to translate into structures or into designs, and that's why I love working with architects, and that's why I choose to work so much with architects, because it's these fruitful discussions that come from that to and fro, and sort of looking across time, and often giving a deeper dive. I've recently worked with a practice, one of Africa's largest African-owned practices, and one of the things that I was working with practice-based researchers, and what they were saying is that we hardly ever get the time to sit down and think these big questions through in this kind of depth, because it's always about turnaround. So I think it's really fruitful when we bring I think it's one of my missions is to bring the academy and practice together, whether it be in architecture or in other practices indeed. So I think that's a really important point to make. But in the concrete, I think we have to start by rethinking the public space. If we look at public spaces, and as I've just done sort of in depth within the historic core of Nairobi and the historic core of Johannesburg, what we see is a complete absence, nearly, especially outside of neoliberal spaces, of seating. These are basic things that make public space function. Public ablutions are, allowing people to be in public space for comfortably. Shade, these things to make the public space visitable and attractive for being in. So I think that's, very basic design levels, one way we can start to address people using the public space as public space. The second thing we have to really bear in mind is security. That's more of a management issue, but it comes into design as well. I think a lot of, I've mentioned this fortress approach. If you look at the design of the barriers, look at Martin Murray's work, for example, on walls in Johannesburg. Since the fall of apartheid, we've seen walls popping up across the city. On residential, on commercial properties, et cetera, as well as cultural properties, as I mentioned earlier. So I think we need to make these spaces feel safe, but I think that's more about presence of people. So in some ways it's the old Jane Jacobs argument that if you get people into the spaces, then it becomes more self-policing. But I also think that with these contexts, there are, especially with the terrorism in Nairobi and the high crime rates that we see in South African cities, that there is a real role for security and policing to be played there, to make those spaces safe. So once you've got that kind of basic architecture in place, and those are things which I think will help dialogue and agonistic discourses beyond heritage as well, which I think is important, that heritage is a part of that. And then once you have that in place, I think we need to start thinking about these, the reuse of surfaces, for example, to tell messages, that we're not just thinking in terms of the monument itself, but bringing in the context and around that public space to tell a longer story. I really like embedding things into the ground itself, into the soil itself, or the whatever paving that you might have. I think that it's also really important that we start to think about digital technologies. Africa as a continent, it has a very high number of mobile phone users. The youth are particularly adept at using mobile phones. cities like Pretoria have experimented with making their downtowns have free Wi-Fi, again, to encourage public space usage. So, again, we could use these public spaces and with digital technologies to encourage the multi-vocality, to bring in some, there's already been 5 years of debates on the Kruger statue plus alone. Why not bring those into the digital realm so that they are accessible within that space and make them pop out at the visitors who come to those spaces? But I also think it's I think we can learn historically from commemorations. Commemorations serve as a sort of micro catalyst on an annual or longer time series, whether it's decades or the centenary of particular anniversaries. They serve as these micro catalysts, and I think that we can't assume that uses of these spaces is going to be flat, but that it's going to very much change over the year, depending on the climate, et cetera, and I think now. And this is something I didn't mention earlier, but I think now that we are looking at COVID and the long-term impacts of COVID, which is having a massive impact on heritage within the continent, we need to start thinking about these. I think the dominant approach has been about using these sites to attract visitors from abroad, as a cultural tourism lure to some of these spaces. And I think we really need to rethink about them as spaces to enable or to enliven the cities themselves for the residents of these cities, not just for the foreign tourist.
Okay, Vincent, is it okay for you as an answer?
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. Just because you mentioned, I'm going to give you maybe like kind of introduce also to the discussion. You mentioned, I saw on the slide where you talked about the Igbo in Nigeria and the introduction of a second public. But yeah, I'm from Nigeria actually, so I'm also Igbo, and that's interesting to see that. But however, I see also maybe because there's this typonyms, so where you have the focus now on heritage, basically like it's in these monuments and stuff, but also you have it in names of cities, and you have it in the public spaces in Nigeria is not the way it is conceptualized here in Europe. So it's always protected. People are not allowed. There's a continuation of this colonial segregation that is already embedded into the governance and stuff. So I was wondering, if we can, this is really very interesting approach to look at heritage, but then of course the practicality as an architect, operating within a context that is already, that is hierarchical, that doesn't really give room for this contestation, because in most cases, contestation is matched with violence. So it could be physical violence, removal, demolition, and so I'm just wondering, the practicality for the architect. I think this is also, you really don't have to be an architect to also make an input. I think it will be really important also for us to get fresh perspectives from somebody that is not an architect. So maybe this is something, but of course your responses are quite satisfactory. And thank you very much for the lecture.
Thank you very much for listening. Just on that point, if I may, I think that there's a lot to be said for really stripping back heritage as a discourse, as I said earlier in the argument. And I think if we're rethinking public spaces within, it's a whole different talk. Rethinking public space within the different African cities, but I think there's a really large role that could be played by thinking about informal trade within public spaces within African cities as a form of contested heritage, and thinking about how I've been toying with an idea about how one could, because often in some contexts there's been a lot of movement towards pushing them out of public space and marginalizing them even further and trying to order the space, which is again a very colonial approach to urban planning and urban management. But I think if we were to take informal trade and use it as not in this sort of Maasai market way that they do in Kenya, but more as a sort of an embedded form of everyday heritage. I think that could be an interesting place to start using heritage in an agonistic way if you wanted to start with a new build rather than something existing.
Vincent, your PhD
we can collaborate.
is about what Britt is talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you should exchange, because Vincent is doing a real interesting PhD, and he can maybe mention the title. I think you might like this.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It's my PhD is basically looking at emergent and self-organization processes of urban growth, but with a focus on markets in cities. And so as a form of also intangible meso-heritage. So basically, maybe it would be nice to really discuss.
Please, I would really enjoy that.
Yeah, so maybe because then I really wouldn't like it to take the discussion away.
Okay, but I
yeah,
think we should
because it's also a different kind of yeah. If I should go back to what you said on the introduction of warrant chiefs, so yeah, there's it's basically you have in the typical Igbo setting, there is no dichotomy between the private and the public space. It's more or less like a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
However, with the introduction of those warrant chiefs, so there is what you have by Peter Eke. He named it as a primordial public and civic public. So there are two publics now.
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, we have a different kind of understanding of public space. So the marketplace now is a real public space that is still part of lived heritage. Whereas what you see, designated, fenced and stuff, is not really regarded as public. I don't even know why. Maybe in the settings that you were talking about, that people don't go there because they really don't relate to it. It's not. It's not part of the literature. But of course,
there's a really
I'm going to send you some
paper on that in the book on deep sustainability. There's a really interesting piece on marketplaces within Nigeria, heritage of marketplaces in Nigeria as deep sustainability. I will try to find that for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Vincent.
Okay, thank you.
There is quite an interesting question also from Ermelinda.
Hello, Ermelinda.
Thanks for the talk. It was highly recommended by my supervisors, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm doing a PhD in archaeology, but I found it quite interesting, your point of decolonizing the mindset. And I often find that I'm originally from Albania, and is part of lots of issues with Yugoslavia and negative memories, but I often find that young scholars are not as prone to decolonizing mindsets. Is it any practical ideas or suggestion that you have how to decolonize the mindset of archaeologists before making radical movements? And
I mean, it's a fairly well-trodden space, but you're right, the model remains the sort of Western European hegemony. So I think that as our role, and what the best thing that we can do right now is to really engage with our colleagues from other, whatever space it is that you're particularly interested in, to read beyond the canon. I think we often get stuck or sucked into that canon, and I think we need to start looking beyond it as much as we can, and to in our practice be very reflexive about who we are including, why we are, how we are working, how we engage beyond the trench or the coalface, so to speak. So I think that there's some fantastic volumes out there, like the work by Achille Mbembe, for example, the Cameroonian scholar, on decolonizing the mind. It's a long tradition that goes back, but I think that at least into the 1960s, but I think that the archaeology is often slow to engage in these in these types of debates. And I mean, if you think about even the real sort of politics of the past agenda really only started being published in a big way in the sort of 1990s. So I think we're starting to move in that direction, you know, and the idea of public archaeology has been growing. But I think that there's a lot more work to be done in that sphere. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ermelinda.
I would like to give the word to Beatrice Kaun, and maybe, if that's possible, Lilet, together with Wim Oers.
Yes, and hi, Beatrice. Yes, we were in a studio, and we worked on the redesign of Troon Square in Brussels. It was a contested heritage because there is a statue of Leopold II that has been smeared every now and then, let's say. And so we tried to redesign, and Beatrice was one of the students who worked on the project, and we were very happy with the project, by the way. And I was just thinking, Lilet, when you were talking about giving the public place a new function or a new way to dialogue or to function on it, that's exactly what the students did as a solution for the design. Instead of placing the statue in the middle, and it was really imposing, they've placed it at another angle. They've also made another interface with it, so that the statue can be experienced, I would say, in a hard way, but also in a soft way. You can feel the different narratives possible. So maybe instead of having a status quo on just leaving it as it is, that's what in Belgium nowadays is morally done. So we just keep it as it is, or we remove it. And I don't think either of them, they are not that good solutions. It's better to find a new dialogue, and that's what you were saying. I was asking the question, but you already answered that question, and so it might be interesting now to go to Beatrice, because she worked on the exercise.
Oh yeah,
very interesting.
I was just going to propose or ask if you could maybe send you an email, and if you have any availability, try to schedule a meeting so we could show you our proposal and see from the point of view of history and someone that is really engaged in the theme of contested heritage, if we could maybe show our proposal and get any feedback.
Absolutely, I'd love to do that.
Right.
Yeah, just drop me an email and we'll find a Zoom time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
for. I'm really interested. I've been engaging with a studio on Great Zimbabwe, which is a different kind of heritage, which I mentioned in the, so not monumental, well, an archaeological site, if you like. But we've also been reimagining it in a variety of ways, and it's one of my, or the students have been reimagining it in a variety of ways, and it's really interesting to see how starting these debates start to permeate into the work that we're seeing coming out of the other side. So I'm really excited about seeing your studio.
Yes, I think it's also interesting to have a look at it, and also for the students to feel how people who are in this kind of matter, like you are, because you are an expert in it, and that you, the response that someone can have like you, and that's important. It's not only the people in the street or etc., but it's also a person who knows the methodology to think about these kind of questions. That is interesting, and I think that's very interesting of you, a very good idea of you to ask that, Beatrice, because we have, by the way, the model in Ghent, in Campus Ghent. There is a model, but we can send you pictures of it as well.
Please, I would very much enjoy that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll contact you soon with the rest of the group. Thank you.
I will send the address to you, Wim. Okay?
That's good. Thank you very much, Gisèle.
By thanking you both, basically, because Gisèle is the one inviting you. So
I'm really happy that you accepted.
And thank you, Britt. It was a really wonderful lecture and extremely enriching. I think it was a lot of food for thought for many people, at least for myself as well. Thank you for kicking off this semester. And I thank all the attendees for staying with us and being with us. I quickly like to point out the lecture of tomorrow, which is the first, as I said, on the Thursday evenings. It's the book presentation actually of the Eugene Tanja selection. Book presentation of a book published by the KU Leuven on student work. So it will be very nice to go through the book, to discuss all the different entries. So basically that is it. Thank you all for tonight. Again, sign up for the newsletter at blog to be informed on all the lectures and lecture series. Go to the YouTube channel to see the earlier lectures in this series. Thank you all. Have a great night, and hope to see you soon.
Absolutely. Thanks once again for this privilege, and for giving me this time, because I know everyone's schedules are busy and you probably have Zoom fatigue. So I appreciate you taking the time out.
No, but I think it's really a very important topic that you're talking about. We have this problematic in ex-Yugoslavia, which is really prominent. We get, let's say, places especially, which are now memorials, but you get huge conflicts because in a way it's again, let's say, causing conflicts. So the memorial itself is also, so for me it's really a topic in which I'm really very interested, because it's a kind of very urgent question also for architects dealing with heritage.
Yeah, I mean, the volume that's going into press now that I've been telling you about on synchronous pasts is, and I know Lilet, you're also interested in time, but it's about how heritage plays with different conceptions of time within that region, and how it's all about contestation. So it's in 3 sections. The first section being about the urban and memory in the urban spaces. The second section being about border spaces and how highly contested it is around.
Yeah.
We're using borders in terms of semiotic borders as well as physical borders in the landscape. And that's been very, I don't know if Francesco's work on, that's what brought us together working actually, was his semiotic approach to borders. And then the final section is on memorials and heritage sites. And I think, one of the things we didn't really talk about today, but is I think we often look at the site as an individual. I know architects have been thinking about this a long time, that we need to broaden the context, but I do really think that this idea of the memory scape is important, and how particular sites interface with existing places, because these spaces are often palimpsestic, but also about how these sites engage with new spaces, like Wim was alluding to. And yeah, I think you'd find that volume really interesting.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
I just need to finish it. Finish the editing.
but it's really something I really don't know how, as an architect, you have to deal with it. Like in let's say in ex-Yugoslavia, you have, well, collective spaces, schools, whatever, churches, which were used as torture rooms. I mean, so it's the essence of a community, and so you have this community buildings which were misused, let's say. And so how can you ever, because this agonistic idea is
so I mean, that's what I mean, that's why I talk about the former Yugoslavia in terms of conflict time, because what I'm saying there is that at least since the Second World War, if not before, it's not been seen as separate conflicts. They're often regarded as the same conflict that's just continued. So, like you'll see in the reporting on the conflict in the 1990s that the Second World War names for people were reasserted. So like the Ustaše and the Chetniks, and even in the interim period we regard as peaceful, there was still antagonistic conflict going on in terms of so-called terrorist attacks, incarcerations, Dražen Mihalović being on the loose for a long time, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to see there, even when did the conflict in Croatia finish, for example, is a difficult question to answer, because 2/3 of this, or a third of the state was in the Krajina until long after the peace agreement, so a new peace accord came in. So it's this constant shifting of even, you know, when does something start and when does something finish? You see the same thing in Rwanda, you know, like even what numbers do you put?
Yeah.
You know, what alphabet do you use? And what spelling? You know, these are all highly charged questions. And in the former Yugoslavia, I think you have there's this, I don't know if do you speak any Croatian or
no, unfortunately
no. Idea of život is life, but then you have this idea of suživot, which is cohabiting. So it's an idea that we're not sharing this space. We are living in parallel. And I think what we see, you know, is like Kardov argues this, is that we don't have public space proper in the former Yugoslavia anymore. It's ethnicized space. So it's Croatized space, it's Serbicized space, it's, you know, Bosnian space. It's not truly collective public space. And, you know, I think the problem there also is if you start to venture in that direction, you get bashed with being Yugo-nostalgic. You know?
That's a bit what I fear, is that it's might be a bit naive also as an architect of thinking that you can help solving. I don't think you can solve. So in that idea, I really like the idea of agonistic, but then you have to have, you need equal partners. I mean,
it's so difficult. There's some interesting projects that have been happening in Mostar with an NGO where they've been trying to rethink heritage in the city, but again, they're labeled Yugo-nostalgics often. But, you know, that's a really good city to look at in terms of those approaches. I think, you know, Bosnia has potentially more possibility for this kind of work because it's, you know, the other states have become majority. They have one ethnic majority, whereas in Bosnia and Herzegovina you still have three. You know, you have two entities within the same state. You have it's more like Belgium in some way in terms of parallel institutions and things like that. So there is a recognition that it's not finished. You know, that it's ongoing. That whereas in other parts it's more they want to sometimes draw a line. So I think there's potentially more openness there, but I'm happy I'd love to talk to you about this in much. I'm not sure if you want to do this now or another time, but
super. I think we will definitely talk about this again.
And I'd love to hear more about, you know, what you're working on. I think there's so many, like Daniel Leibovitz's work on ruptures in that area, you know, as an architect. I think sometimes just providing alternative imaginations is as powerful as producing something. It's about that process. I don't know. I hope I made sense in the question. Sometimes
maybe just trying to create things that maybe trigger kind of reflections. I don't know.
Or stories or open up to create different stories maybe. I've been a lot in Beirut and still, and there are all those remnants, of course, of the civil war, what we tend to call the hot potatoes in the city. With that, the Hilton Hotel, maybe you're aware of those spots. Where nobody can have a plan for, but nobody can touch because everybody has a different story to that memory. But at the same time, you cannot erase it. I mean, it should stay, but what to do with it and how to address it or how to approach it, how to make a plan for it that it's not immediately being tackled by the other. And then with public space, I remember the first time we came there, we were very naive and thought of making a plan for Martyrs Square, which is extremely important square politically, also in the whole direction where it is. And then I never forget that we said, yeah, but why is there on this beautiful big square, this important square, why is it a parking lot? Why is nothing happening here? Why is it something that looks like a kind of place to use or commemoration or gathering place? Or and then somebody said, yeah, but it starts already like what direction you give the space, because if you give something there, then it's immediately towards the east, and that means something. It's basically what you say about language is about even giving a north or an east or a south direction.
Colors are hugely important. You know, what colors you're using in these contexts. I mean, we did some work with conflict in cities, which was a really great project. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was one that I talked about last time I was in Leuven, actually, at that conference.
Yes, you talked about, it was super interesting.
And that was a big collaboration that we did on Europe and the Middle East, on divided cities in Europe and the Middle East. And one of the things that we, heritage is, it's automatically a symbol. It's automatically going to be sort of contested as soon as you put it into that frame, where we found people collaborating on a sort of larger, on a more formal plan was on infrastructure. When you needed a shared function, that was what was bringing people together. So, like sewage doesn't care what side of the border is on, it needs to go somewhere, right? Or water, these are things that those are the first things that in Cyprus they were able to come together and to speak about. But the book that Anita Bakshi did for the series, the Palgrave series that I co-edited, she's an architect, and she did work on the seam line in Nicosia. And because you're not allowed to, you're literally not allowed to touch it because it's still a UN protected area, she mapped it. And I think sometimes just the act of mapping, so many of these spaces, we have no idea what they were actually like, what was the quotidian space, and that these were such, in that case, it was such a highly plural zone, where, because it was a shopping street or a shopping area, people were right in the center of the city, people were coming to use that space for practical reasons, and that was what was causing that interface. I'm very critical of neoliberal models, but having said that, one of the other researchers on the project found that the spaces that people were interacting with were not the squares in Israel-Palestine. They weren't those formal open spaces those spaces were highly policed and therefore impossible. The places that people were actually meeting were the spaces of malls, where it was really considered neutral, because it was like a space of globalized shopping. So it didn't feel like it was Palestinian, it didn't feel like it was Israeli, it felt like this globalized space. So I think in some contexts that, these very quotidian functional purposes have to come first, and that's why I was saying maybe we, starting with the basics. I think sometimes we forget the basics. We think build it and they will come, but let's put in the infrastructure for discussion first, and then maybe, because in many of those cities, especially in cities in the former Yugoslavia, they were plural, they were very multicultural at one point, and now even the bars that you sit in are is it your bar? Is it your bar? Depending on whose beer they're selling in which bar, and is it this coffee? Is this coffee shop is Serb and this coffee shop is Croatian? But what can we put in? Like just a simple thing like a bench is huge. Going to just providing the opportunity for pause, because otherwise people are just passing. They're never engaging in any way, shape, or form. But the other thing I just wanted to say about that, I was going somewhere, I've forgotten. Anyway, long day.
I just have one reflection. Maybe is it too early in ex-Yugoslavia maybe to think about agonistic?
No, I don't think so. I think we have to we have to do that work, you know. It's very much, it can't be externally, you have to get buy-in from the actors, you know, and this is what I think, even like, you know, if you can't agree, you know, if you're in this very highly antagonistic setting, which they are, then why not create sort of these cycles, you know, of okay, so your important commemoration day is X, and your important commemoration, or your Christmas is X and your Christmas is Y. So we'll start there, and you can have this space to send, you know, to talk about Christmas before, you know, now, for example. And I think, I think stripping it back from, you know, if we go into that pre-war period, and we ask people to talk about their real everyday lives, then we avoid, it's still charged, but it's not as charged as taking the war as a starting point, because that's what I want to say. There's a really fascinating memorial, talking to your point, Lilet, about the detritus of war, which we see in these spaces in the former Yugoslavia. And in Vukovar is the city that I've worked on most, but there was a statue put up there, and during the so-called peaceful reintegration period. So the UN had this 2-year period where it was the only space, large or major city in Croatia that wasn't retaken by force. It was supposed to be reintegrated by the UN. And during that period, an artist asked the locals and the refugees who were living in the city to collect, and those are mainly Serbs, but there were others as well, to collect pieces of their ruined homes. And they each were given a slab of concrete in the shape of a house, you know, very sort of child's drawing of a house. And they were able to put those fragments of their house into those concrete and then display them together as this like sort of falling house, because that was a collective trauma, the loss of one's house. But, you know, I find this memorial incredibly prosaic. It's very difficult to find anything about it now. But for what I was kind of surprised by was that when I was doing my interviews in the city, no one talked about that space. No one really knew about it. And then I discovered the reason was because the municipality had built a playground next to it. And so people just thought it was part of the playground because it was at sort of that height for children to engage with. And so there is still this sense that, you know, a proper memorial is what is needed. You know, that was one thing that there's a large poll, and I can't remember, it was like 2014 or something, where people said they wanted memorials for justice. So there's this need for it, but I think many people in the population have this idea of a memorial being the durable bronze thing. And I think that's what we need to start. I think that's what we can push, because they have a history of, you know, amazing memorials from, you know, particularly from the Yugoslav period, which were, you know, very path-breaking in terms of their design. So I think that can be touched into again without, you know, it has to be a new aesthetic. It can't be the sort of Yugoslav aesthetic or the non-aligned aesthetic. But I think there could be an appetite for something different, you know, away from the bronze. But
no, really fascinating. Thank you so much, and I
hope that was what you were looking for.
Yeah, it was super, super, super interesting, and I really hope we will continue to exchange. And
please, let's do that. I'm sorry I rushed a bit at the end. I just looked at my watch and realized it was overtime. So, so I thought, go.
No, super. Thank you very much.
Thanks again.
Have a nice evening.
Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, so thanks so much, Lilet, for giving me the opportunity to come back and just follow up on some of the questions that were asked in the discussion after my lecture. You know, they really left me with some ideas percolating in my mind, and I thought I should just turn back and address some of them more explicitly. So Abir's comment about whether or not, when the collective feels that these monuments should be taken down, isn't that what should happen? And I just want to make sure that it was clear that I think, yes, that is what should happen in those cases if the collective feels that way. I don't think that we as heritage practitioners should be afraid of what I've called that rubbish phase. But having said that, I also and I made that clear in the discussion as well, is I don't think that we should be looking at one size fits all solutions. So I don't think we should say all colonial model or monuments should end up in a museum space or in park spaces, because first of all, as I said in the discussion, especially within many African contexts, museums aren't really visited, so they'll just become storage spaces where they aren't really engaged with. And you know, the recontextualization brings in new curatorial questions and problematics as well. So I think it's definitely an option in some situations, but I don't think it's the only option, and it's that I want to explore. I also think that once these go into the rubbish phase and enter into the museum space or into its storage space, that's not necessarily the end of the story. As we looked at last time, sometimes they come back out of these spaces and back into so-called public space. And I made a lot of comments about public space and its problematic nature within African context last time, so I won't go back into that today. But I think Abir's point about re-traumatization of victims and victim descendants is a really important one, and that's true whether or not we leave monuments in situ or we remove them. I think that we have to be always conscious as heritage practitioners of that question of re-traumatization and what does that mean for our practice. So what are some of these architectural translations? I think that's what many of the architectural students and practitioners who were involved in the discussion, that was sort of the burning question that I left dangling at the end of my presentation. And especially in response to Gisèle and Vincent's questions about that, I just wanted to look at a couple of examples, both of what can inspire us what to do with existing spaces, and also order some possible ideas for some new introductions into these types of spaces. So I'm just going to give you a few sort of headline ideas and examples that go along with that, rather than sort of diving deep into a whole plethora of examples for each one. So as you can see on the title slide here, I'm still thinking about monuments as effigies within this agonistic proposal that I'm trying to make. And I think that Banksy's proposals to redesign the Colson Monument, which was taken down in 2020, by re-erecting it in this sort of falling position with new statues of protesters taking it down, I think is an incredibly powerful statement. So you're leaving the monument almost in situ, but you're recontextualizing it within that space. And I think that's a really interesting type of proposal that we can look at. I think the most classic response that we've had when we leave things in situ is this idea of juxtaposition. So here, coming back to the example from Shwane or Pretoria, which I drew on a lot last week, you can see the Martinus and Andries Pretorius, who the city is named after or was named after. And in post-1994, the municipality was renamed after Chief Shwane, and you can see his statue at the back of the image here. So he was inserted into the same space to cause dialogue, to have a recontextualization of the existing monuments. And I think there's a lot we can do with juxtaposition within situ to further those types of agonistic discussions. There's obviously the idea of the counter monument with James Young, and I'm just going to move I don't know if you can see on your screen, but I'm moving my dialogue box so that you can see at the back. This is a counter monument called The Lost Men by Paul Emanuel, which was put up in Grahamstown. And it's a piece of art. So the pieces of fabric that he uses are they're not permanent, they're temporary, it's a temporary installation, but he's put it up against the backdrop of the Settlers Monument. And here he's speaking about the people who were lost in the frontier wars, and he lists both black and white members of the population or combatants who lost their lives during those wars, and juxtapositions it against the settler monument as a sort of counter monument. So I think there's a lot of power in the counter monument. This is an example from an African context, but I think we can look at counter monuments in general to think of more ideas of how this could be an important way to engage for agonism. Then, as I mentioned before, technology for agonism, I was talking a lot about audio in the discussion, but I think that this project by Krzysztof Wodishko, which was in New York in the Union Square, here he interviewed American veterans from recent conflicts, and he projected and had audio. So he projected the faces of those individuals onto the existing statue of Lincoln and brought in their stories into this space. So again, I think this is another way to bring multivocality into spaces, is using either audio or visual. And I'll come back to another example of that later on. And here is the example, is the memorials canvas. So this is the Confederate Monument in Virginia that you're probably all familiar with from the coverage, extensive coverage that it got last year. And you can see that it's been covered in graffiti, but it's also been used as a space of projection. And I think that we should think about, you know, yes, it is expensive to remove graffiti. Yes, it does have its, you know, it can be damaging to the monument, but are there ways that we can invite the public to engage? We can think of the famous counter monument in Hamburg, where individuals were asked to inscribe their thoughts onto the monument as it gradually sank into the ground. So I think this idea of, you know, of taking them out of this do not touch space and bringing them into something where it's more hands-on. So out of the fortress conservation, which we talked about before, and into engage with me, is something important that we can do with memorials. And then there's the conceal reveal idea. So again, this is another option for doing in situ. This is the Churchill Monument, which was covered up with a box. And you know, this is reminiscent for me of more playful interventions like Christo's wrapping of heritage objects, or indeed of grassroots memorials where people come and stick tags and things like that to it. So here they've left it as a gray box, but I think we could use the box as a vehicle for expression. And even thinking, you know, if there's a higher budget, because budget is obviously something that's very important in these contexts, is, you know, is it a box that can reveal and conceal? You know, is it something that can come up and down or change opacity so that you can see what's behind it, as a way to recognize the trauma, but also, you know, bring agonism into this space. And I take Vincent's point about many African countries being ethnocracies rather than democracies very seriously, and I think he has a very valid point. But into that, I would say two things. One is that many ethnocracies exist outside of the African context, and they refer to themselves as democracies, but once you scratch the surface, it's very clear that there is something else going on there. And here is, you know, again, agonism is not about winning or losing the debate. It's about the struggle, right? So I think the system of ethnocracies is immoral and wrong, but I don't think we're going to be able to change that as practitioners immediately. But what we can do is use our work as part of the struggle for change. And this exhibition, called the Traveling Testimonies exhibition, which deals with the memories of various conflicts in Uganda, is one that I think that has done that quite successfully. You can read more about this exhibition in that book that I mentioned, African Heritage Challenges, which I published last year. And this is the chapter by Cara Blackmore. And in that, they invited different members of the public to come and donate their items to the exhibition. They asked them to come and donate their testimonies, and they also asked them to come and participate in collective artworks. So in this particular piece, I Am Ugandan, people were asked to write thoughts, to paint ideas onto the canvas, and as it was layered over and over, it became increasingly abstract. So I think, yes, high art is often seen as something that's exclusive. It's a language that not everyone understands. But I think when we move into this space of art and co-curatorship, I think it becomes, there's possibilities for agonism that emerge. And here's another really interesting tool, you know, thinking about what interventions can enable discussion within these sites. And this is the Future Farmers Residency at Open Fields at the Walker in Minneapolis. And what they did was they created this giant megaphone. And the only way that you can use it to enhance the voice of the people unheard, or often unheard, is by collectively holding it up. And I think of this idea of, you know, to be heard, we must listen by holding each other up, is a really powerful one. And I think it's something we can play with more for to promote this. And then you know, we talked about memorials effigy, but we can also think of memorials as stage. So this is the One and Other project by Anthony Gormley at Trafalgar Square on the 4th plinth. And what he basically asked was people to sign up and stand on the plinth for an hour, and they were allowed to do whatever they wanted to on that. And some of it was, you know, quite flippant or self-aggrandizing types of interventions that happened, but then there was also real protest that happened on this space as well. So this is a Jerry Byrne, who is asking for the nationalization of Vestas, which had just laid off quite a number of workers in the period just leading up to this. So I think, you know, this idea of using it as stage is something interesting, and that's what the Uganda Project did as well. They had a lot of dance interventions, which is again drawing on local traditions to express trauma in and around the exhibition. I think that's something we could explore around memorials as well. And you know, and I think we really need to think about, you know, outside of the box of the bronze statue, specifically within the African context. But I think if we look at other transitional processes, like the transitional justice processes that we've seen in Sierra Leone, Rwanda, South Africa, Liberia, Uganda, they've also drawn on local notions of justice and local practices of justice to make those transitional courts effective. And I think we should be localizing the response to within the individual culture that sits around it. So I don't think we can critique the TRC, and there's a lot of literature on that, but I think there are possible learnings that we could bring into the architectural sphere from them. So those were the main points that I would think about to as a response to what does an architectural translation look like. And again, I'm happy to take this discussion further in other formats as well, if that's useful for you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for these afterthoughts. Super interesting. And yeah, you put them so nice all in a row as inspiration, I think, and a lot of examples actually that students will learn from. Yeah, the Sam Durant for sure. Super nice. Thanks a lot for this. It's really an extra, a gift, let's say, from you to us. So
Absolutely.
thanks a lot. Indeed, let's continue the discussion in later stages. And the library is already augmented with your books. So we are very pleased with that. Thanks a lot, and till the next time.
Absolutely. Thanks again. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.